Good afternoon. Hello. Welcome to this year's Harry C. Howard Jr. Lecture. My name is Mona Frederick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities. We're going to have several pre-speakers before our speaker, and I think the anthropologists in the room would tell us this reflects the status of our speaker today. So thank you, Chairman Petey, for allowing us to show you your status. Not only are we marking today the Harry Howard Lecture that the Warren Center sponsors, but we're also celebrating the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Robert Penn Warren Center for the Humanities. Located in the Vaughn home, in the heart of our campus, the center is an intellectual hub for colleagues from around our campus and around the world. The original mission statement, I think this is interesting, this was written in 1987. The original mission statement reads that the center was established to, quote, enhance the growth and development of the study of the humanities at Vanderbilt by promoting research, teaching, and writing within disciplines and across disciplinary lines, by bringing scholars with kindred scholarly interests together in a stimulating and supporting environment. I think you'll agree that the Warren Center has succeeded in its mission at the very highest level. I didn't expect all this, so I have to speed up all these pre-speakers. But other than today's event, how many of you have participated in a Warren Center project or a program? I think almost everyone in the room has raised their hand. You are the reason that the Warren Center is a thriving, creative, and collaborative program. Since its inception, the Warren Center has sponsored 192 Vanderbilt faculty fellows, representing 33 areas of study in its annual Faculty Fellows program. Beginning in 1994, the center was able to include a year-long visiting scholar as a part of the program. The center has hosted 25 eminent scholars from 20 academic institutions, representing 9 scholarly disciplines. The Warren Center sponsors roughly a dozen monthly seminars and reading groups each year, co-directed by faculty members or graduate students. These seminars are attended by large numbers of our colleagues from across the university. A sampling of topics this year includes critical approaches to African studies, film theory and visual culture, and pre-modern cultural studies, to name but a few. Many hundreds of distinguished speakers have been brought to our campus under the aegis of these groups. During the past 5 years alone, the Warren Center has hosted 293, that's a pretty exact number, 293 visiting speakers from around the world. Initially envisaged as a faculty development program, the Warren Center expanded its scope in 2005 to include graduate student programming. That year, the Warren Center initiated its first annual Graduate Student Fellows program, funding 7 graduate students engaged in humanistic research in the College of Arts and Science who are at the dissertation completion stage. The Warren Center has now supported, here's more numbers, the Warren Center has now supported 101 distinguished young scholars from 11 disciplines, many of whom now have been granted tenure at their institutions. The center has created strong partnerships with humanities organizations, such as Humanities Tennessee, the Consortium of Humanities Centers and Institutes, and the National Humanities Alliance. These are but a very few examples of the breadth and the scope of the Warren Center's influence on our campus and beyond. We are incredibly grateful, Chairman Petey, to the National Endowment for the Humanities for its early support of the fledgling program. In 1989, the NEH awarded the center a $480,000 challenge grant. This grant provided a strong endorsement for the brand new program. It required, however, $1.9 million in matching funds. That was hard. But due to the strength of the humanities at Vanderbilt, the unswerving support of the university leadership, and contributions from Vanderbilt alumni and others, the program secured the required funds, thus establishing a permanent endowment and ensuring the long-term future of the vibrant program. On a personal note, I have been with the center since its inception, and it is a great honor and a distinct privilege to celebrate the 30th anniversary of its founding with Chairman Peedy in our midst. Thank you again for coming. I will now turn the podium over to our next pre-speaker, Edward Friedman, who has served as faculty director of the Warren Center for 11 years, and who is the Gertrude Conway Vanderbilt Chair in the Humanities. Professor Friedman, as you all know, is a giant in the field of early modern Spanish literature, is an award-winning teacher, and an extraordinary colleague. Professor Friedman.
Thank you very much, Mona. I've never been called a giant before, and I don't deserve that, but thank you. Along with the Center's Executive Director, Mona Frederick, I'm happy to welcome you to the 25th Harry C. Howard Jr. Lecture. The lecture series was established in 1994 through an endowment established by Mr. and Mrs. Thomas E. Nash, Jr. and Mr. and Mrs. George D. Renfro, all of Asheville, North Carolina, to honor Mr. Howard, a 1951 Vanderbilt alumnus. The series has brought a truly eminent group of scholars, journalists, artists, political commentators, and public intellectuals to Vanderbilt, and this year is no exception. We are delighted to have with us the chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities, John Parrish Peedy. Chairman Peedy will be introduced by Chancellor Nicholas S. Zeppos, who has been an enthusiastic advocate of the Warren Center and of the humanities, for which we are most grateful. Chancellor Zeppos' boundless enthusiasm, goodwill, legal skills, and dedication to students, faculty, administration, and staff have contributed most notably to Vanderbilt's high standing in the academic world. We thank equally profoundly Provost Susan Wente and Dean John Geer of the College of Arts and Science for their support. Thank you all for being here. Again, I'm delighted to be able to greet you and to call upon Chancellor Zeppos to introduce our distinguished guest. Thank you.
Well, it's really wonderful to be here, and as much as we talk about hierarchies, I think, and I mean this kind of seriously, we have to talk about ritual, because we are all always enacting and in many ways performing what we do as scholars and teachers in the service to humanity. And so many people from outside look at us and they kind of say, this is feudal, within DAL, not an ILE, although there are times when you're working on manuscripts, you might say that. But I think it's really important for us to recognize that we come together as a scholarly community to listen and learn and to continue conversations about important topics, which we will do today. It is just great to be here, and I'm looking forward to the Harry C. Howard Lecture, the Vanderbilt Tradition, and Individual Talent. We not only need to, we talk about celebrating the humanities, and this is our 30th anniversary, not only because it deepens our understanding of who we are, what our cultures are, what our civilizations are. They are foundational to our work, but we have to perform and do the humanities. I'm an unapologetic supporter, and I tell my humanist colleagues, stop saying crisis. The shelf life of a science paper is 3 months. Really. I mean, we're fighting with Elsevier. We're fighting with Elsevier. Can we get this thing? Can you wait 3 months? And it's like, we're still reading Plato. You know, Jane is still discovering slavery manuscripts and the documents of enslaving human beings that sit in buildings and churches and ports. And that is timeless work. So we celebrate everything we do here, but we take with deep commitment our humanistic inquiry and work. And my colleagues in the medical school, where they're doing surgery, whether they're doing psychiatry, they are all humanists. They are healing, they are caring, they are trying to understand, and they cheer for us. They are not antagonistic. They are complementary and supportive. And they are very engaged in the work that we have. I want to recognize Mona, 30 years, leading, being there at the start, kind of like the founder, is really quite remarkable. Mona corrected me. We are not old friends. We are long-standing friends. But let me talk to you about another great friend and another great friend of Vanderbilt. And it is my honor to introduce the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, John Parrish Peedy, as today's speaker. John is the 11th chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. And while it's always great to have a person of your stature and importance to speak on our campus, we take special note and pride in the fact that you are, yes, a Vanderbilt alumnus. And I'm sure this library was where you spent many hours, John, as I can well imagine. And so John he's drunk from the stream. He's walked on the walkways. He has sat with scholars and knows our traditions, our past, and our very bright future. Last April, John, and I think John should get like a Bronze Star for this, he was confirmed quite easily by the U.S. Senate as chairman of the NEH. And it was on the merits and an abiding love of poetry, literature, and what great universities do for our society. He has a very distinguished vita, previous roles including the publisher of the Virginia Quarterly Review at the University of Virginia, the literary grants director at the NEA, and counselor to NEA chairman Dana Gioia. His degree from at Vanderbilt is in English, as we would want. And when I hear all of this, and I'm not anti-technology, but when I was like, people say, well, you got to learn code. And I said, well, why don't you read great literature? That's your code. That's the human code. That's the pathway into the breadth of our potential as human beings. So yes, he is an English major, but he is a true interdisciplinarian. He pursued a variety of topics here and classes, and I'm sure quite with vigor and energy, from history to Latin to, of course, the sciences. His career, and when you meet your English students, you say, well, what can I do? It's like, you can be a speechwriter in the White House. You can run a cabinet-level agency. You can run a big publication and grow its business and its revenue. That's what we do, and you feel good about it every day that you do it. So John is an interdisciplinarian, but he is, like Vanderbilt, a true champion of the humanities. John, it is a distinct pleasure to have you return to campus. Congratulations on the path you've walked, and we've been privileged to call you our alumnus. So I'm pleased to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Y'all hear me well enough? Yes, great. I wrote this speech mostly over the the weekend and up into this morning, fact-checking myself. And I wanted to stick rather closely to it, but I'll say a few words at the front. First, though, thank you, Chancellor. Thank you for your words, for your presence. I have insight to how busy your schedule is every day. I know this is a particularly important day for you, and thank you for being here with us. To have a chancellor here, to have a provost here together, I know a bit about what that commitment means. And so on behalf of my colleagues, I thank you, but in a larger way, on behalf of those who care about the liberal arts, I thank you. Mona, I'll say later in Q&A and other things how much you've meant. It's wonderful the three of us arrived. I know we both arrived at the same year. I believe that was your year too, and it's worked out all right, I think, for all of us. And I, because I was a book editor for a good while, I have bifocal, so I can't see too deeply, but I'm glad to know a familiar face. She's mentioned later in the speech, but Susan Ford Wiltshire. Can we? And she was, I looked at it as I was preparing for this, thinking I'd studied with her 2-3 times. It's not that I was really in her classroom that much. And I will say, and maybe you can help me out here, I took something like 24 hours of classical studies, but I only did Latin, I didn't do my Greek, and so they would not award me a minor. So maybe you can, because Susan plays hardball on the, expectation that you'll, yes, yeah. I don't know if you have the authority to tackle her, but whatever you can do. But I look back over letters. Some letters, I've given to the special collections here, which was an important part of my life. As an undergraduate, I would see a photograph I liked, and I would pay my money to have a black and white made and have it in my dorm room. It meant something to me in ways I'll speak of. But the idea that our professors were looking at us as individuals. When I was trying to decide what happened, I switched from chemistry so late, and I think my senior year I finally declared English, that what I was doing next wasn't clear to me. And fortunately, Bill Ferris, who I was just with at Chapel Hill, asked me to study under him for an interdisciplinary master's. And so I'm the only chairman of the NEH educated by another chairman. He was, of course, President Clinton's chairman. And whenever you're in the presence of a mentor, such as Bill Ferris, such as Susan, you always feel that awareness. You feel a hierarchy, even if they don't say that. And so I was already going to share the stage with Bill, and then last month he won 2 Grammys. And I thought, why would you do that? So Susan, said, is there going to be a Q&A? She said, I'd love to hear your writing. So before you started talking, I started writing on the back here what I'm reading, lest I draw a blank. So that gives you just the sense of the specialness. And I will say some remarks about the endowment, about the humanities. But if you'll allow me, I am going to say a personal story, too, a bit of memoir in some ways. So again, I'm so honored to deliver the Howard Lecture in recognition of the 30-year anniversary of the establishment of the Warren Center. I know that $480,000 challenge grant was essential to the establishment. One thing I started back as chairman 2 years ago is that we are doing infrastructure grants again. And I think that's important. Those grants are up to $750,000, and I've seen libraries in West Virginia made a difference. We were just in Philadelphia at Christ Church and to restore the steeple. And when you see George Washington's on the rolls, when you see Benjamin Franklin, you connect in a very particular way. And I want to say something else, too. That wonderful day, I believe it was 6 signers of the Declaration of Independence have been members there. And we got to decide out of all our grantees who we might have come forward. We also had Denise Dennis, wonderful woman. I've never met her before. I feel like we're fast friends now. And the Dennis Farm, a couple hours from Philadelphia, she's the 8th generation of African-American family that's had that land in their holdings for more than 150 years. And so through our infrastructure grants, they're going to tell the story of America in a way that would be incomplete if it was just Christ Church. This is a both-and agency, and so we'll be talking a lot more about that. And to give you a sense of state, I was so glad to see the head of Humanities Tennessee here. Over the last 10 years, our agency's awarded $20 million to scholars and organizations in this state, and a lot of them, of course, scholars at this very university. We had a wonderful lunch with some of them today. But it is our sister agency, our partner at the state level, that is great about getting into each county. So thank you, Tim, to you and your staff. And even though the sciences may consume more of the budget and generate more of the revenue, we are gathered at a university that has always had the liberal arts at its core. Indeed, its own founding sprang from the need to heal a broken country through the educating of a new generation. There is nothing more clearly in the wheelhouse of the humanities and in the liberal arts than uniting people through the development of their minds. The humanities unveil lives, reveal cultures, explain nations to themselves and to the world. Those who love the arts and the humanities cannot prevail in the long run, I believe, if we don't make clear, cogent cases for our public value, our economic value, our irrefutable societal value. To the extent that I am capable of making such arguments myself, I must credit this extraordinary university and those who educated me here in and out of the classroom. 100 years ago this year, T.S. Eliot published his essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, which he incorporated into his canonical book, The Sacred Wood, the following year. Late in his life, Eliot criticized the essay as juvenile, and he did not, and I think it's important, he did not exclude it from his selected or collected works. He seemed to understand, as we do today, that the essay played an important role in the development of his critical voice, though the structural unevenness and the semantic impulsiveness of the work show through in hindsight. I fear the same may be said of my own efforts here today, but thank goodness when you give out money for a living, no one points out when you fail. Now, I studied Eliot on this campus some 30 years ago under Professor Vereen Bell, an experience more exacting and, yes, let us do that, yes, yeah. Yeah. I studied Eliot on this campus some 30 years ago under Professor Vereen Bell, an experience more exacting and nerve-wracking than my confirmation by the U.S. Senate. So I am not about to hazard an academic lecture on the poet or poetry or the essay in question, lest Professor Bell get word of my folly. But I do want to use the essay as a jumping-off point in a broad way to discuss the life of the undergraduate and our responsibilities to her, to discuss the direction of higher education and how the humanities and the NEH play into such matters. And here and there, I will share about my own academic journey and gratitude to my mentors. Indeed, my fondness for tradition may be tied to them, for they gave me a way of seeing the world which has had such lasting value that I would not wish it to perish without some attempt to illuminate it, to affirm it, to claim it, even as I am engaged daily in funding the very scholars and humanistic projects that are expanding and occasionally displacing their life's work. In 1919, in the aftermath of the Great War, the concept of tradition as a societal positive was rightfully out of fashion and understandably maligned on the continent. Even the novelist Ford Madox Ford, who mourned the fragmenting of the British Empire in his profound wartime tetralogy, had to acknowledge that there is a well-trodden path from feudal chivalry to trench warfare. Thus, Eliot wrote of tradition, quote, "Seldom, perhaps, does the word appear except in a phrase of censure, If otherwise, it is vaguely approbative, with the implication as to the work approved of some pleasing archaeological reconstruction. I think it was right then, maybe even more so today. To state my case, I think we should reclaim tradition, or the best of it rather, and should do so properly. Tradition refined, not destroyed, but we cannot reclaim it without first acknowledging who was left out, and left out by whom and why. We must claim the tradition of the Harlem Renaissance, not only the Italian Renaissance. We must claim the tradition of Mozart, but also Motown, of Shakespeare, but also the suffragettes. Not just Keats' Truth and Beauty, but Sojourner Truth's too. This is my personal philosophy, but also my professional one as a grant maker. To truly create a vibrant and healthy and sustainable culture, the answer is almost always both and, rather than either or. As a Vanderbilt alumnus, I take pride in the creation of the new critical literary movement by faculty and students from this campus, even as I fiercely reject the racial prejudice of Donald Davidson, and the anti-Semitism of Eliot, who was aligned with their movement. Indeed, one of the habits of mind that I learned here is that we must bring a level of discernment to works of art, literature, and music in order to separate the creator from the creation. I learned here that we should always direct a critical eye toward what we hazard to admire. The creator often lets us down. Eliot introduced the concept of the adjective correlative in an essay on Hamlet. So how then did he not learn to view Jewish people with common decency through the very reading of Shakespeare? I studied The Merchant of Venice and Benson Hall, which was a red-bricked womb for my intellectual development, and read beyond the stereotypes and the divisive tropes to Shylock's unforgettable, piercing lines. I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is. If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, will we not revenge? If we are like you in the rest, we will resemble you in that. For me, the Vanderbilt tradition must include Shakespeare. I worry about a time when such a gifted writer is no longer taught because of the limits of his understanding of humanity. I worry about what is happening on campuses where we do not have spaces, such as the Robert Penn Warren Center, where scholarly arguments can be addressed in a constructive manner. I worry, that is, about the direction of the modern university that is no longer rooted in the humanities. I mean rooted. I mean anchored down to the bedrock of the foundational tradition of the free exchange of ideas. I worry we are losing this essential tradition. We are increasingly living in an age where the quick knee-jerk reaction on social media stands in as a substitute for actual dialogue. In recent weeks, on yet another campus, students piled up chairs around a stage and beat drums to prevent an invited guest from speaking. I do not understand the impulse to build literal barricades to block ideas that appall us. Our brains are not such fragile things. If an undergraduate never hears an intelligently stated position that she disagrees with, then her tuition payments have been squandered. A university cannot simultaneously lack viewpoint diversity and call itself diverse. So I am on the side of free speech in every context that does not physically endanger other people. I agree with the University of Chicago position on freedom of expression. And I do believe that we need more diversity, including ideological diversity on our campuses. But I have no interest as a taxpayer, as an educator, a former student or parent, in bringing a white supremacist to campus, for example, to shout provocative, ignorant statements. There is no intellectual grounding in this odious position. I would not want my time, my tax dollars, or my tuition spent on that. As a grant maker, my job is literally to make value judgments. So yes, some speech is more worthy of federal investment than others. Tocqueville over trolls. The Vanderbilt of today is better than my Vanderbilt. More economically and geographically diverse, more racially and ethnically diverse, more inclusive, more international. Its financial aid support is more generous and more comprehensive. Now, I have a recusal from voting for funding of this institution while my daughter attends the Blair School of Music, so I'm allowed to openly celebrate Vanderbilt's achievements. But coming back to the issue of tradition, I hope that the leadership over coming decades finds a way to continue to be innovative without losing sight of what makes Vanderbilt singular, especially its grounding in the humanities. And I feel rather strongly about Vanderbilt and its educational policies because this university more or less saved my father's life. His own father worked in steel mills, and he was a hard man. My father did not matriculate to Vanderbilt so much as escaped to it some 65 years ago. He had one life ahead of him before he came here, and another destiny afterwards. The last thing he did every night before bed was take off his Vanderbilt class ring and string it through the leather band of his watch. And he'd close the clasp, and he would turn out his bedside lamp for 5 hours of sleep before he woke again to perform surgery. He was a fine surgeon and a remarkable diagnostic doctor. He died of a heart attack at 58 at work with a patient's chart in his right hand. Same hand that he had his class ring on. I have his Vanderbilt ring now with his blue stone the color of my eyes and his eyes and my daughter's. My father dropped out of Vanderbilt repeatedly according to family lore, transferred to other schools, drove dynamite to the quarries for the mills in the summer to make money, and I think just to feel more alive. And then he invariably re-enrolled after his latest wanderlust was over. I was undisciplined here too. That's an understatement. I felt that some 2 or 3 million books in a library is what we were paying for. I lived in the stacks. I believe it was the PS 3500 row. And The Sun Also Rises, Hemingway's character says that he went broke in 2 ways, went bankrupt in 2 ways, that is, gradually and then suddenly. That's how I bombed out of pre-med here. At a certain point, I began skipping the massive science lectures on occasion and instead read Greek mythology and scribbled down bits of poetry while reclining in the uncut grass with my back against the tomb under the trees. And if there are any Vanderbilt doctors in the area that are of my general time period who passed organic chem only because it was graded on a curve, I have one thing to say to you. You're welcome. I'm the guy who scored in the 40s so that you might have your distinguished career. Now, today, the undergraduate students are so serious. I go to campus everywhere, and they're all so serious. They're so focused. They're so stressed. And I wish them more days reading an unassigned book in the grass as the early spring unfolds around them. This is not, alas, what my own father wished for me. As I called him from my dorm at Sam Quad about my latest physics score, made up some kind of excuse about not having enough sleep, about insomnia, he told me, there will be plenty of time to sleep when you're dead. I can't imagine thinking, much less saying such a thing to my daughter. I believe our children need our love as much or more than our knowledge. Indeed, I know they need our love more. But among first-generation, college-educated parents of his generation, my father does not stand out as unduly harsh. He knew that every day in such a place is an honor and a privilege. He knew that entrance to such a place must be earned. And he knew, too, how fortunate I was to be here at all. By my freshman year, we were broke. My father had given up his career, had to give up his career as a surgeon due to strokes and heart attacks. His remarkable capacity for making money was only outstripped by his greater capacity to squander it. So I attended Vanderbilt on Pell Grants, Stafford loans, federal work study at the nephrology lab, and later at the Center for Teaching. And I taught the LSAT test for Kaplan at night. In the summers, I worked at the VA hospital in the surgery ward, and then my uncle's funeral home business, including the embalming room. And I mentioned the Center for Teaching, and I'll pause here to say that you would go and mostly work with international TAs, and they had to pass a certain level of performance to be kept. So you had a lot in your hands, even as a young student, as you're filming them, and they got nervous, and you knew your notes and the film itself would have consequences. And I would go into their married housing and talk to them, and we would go over phonetic issues. And sometimes junior faculty members also went through it. They were coming up for tenure. They wanted to polish. Maybe it won't surprise you to know that Susan Ford Wilshire, as department chair, was somebody that asked us to tape. I said to Ken Bain, who's running the teaching center, I'm not going to give you any notes for how she might improve what she's doing, but I will tape her. But I always loved that, and I thought it always set an example that whatever we're doing, it could be scrutinized, it could be made better. And so that bears repeating at that moment. And in my senior year, I finally abandoned chemistry and biology and switched to English. Zora Hurston called research formalized curiosity, and you have it, of course, etched into your building. And I only kept a single ingredient from my time in hospitals and medical labs, my curiosity. 30 years later, I am asked as NEH chairman if I will fund experiential learning. I am asked if I look favorably upon the medical humanities. I answer yes because of the academic research in support of it. But the truth is deeper, and it resides in the ruins of my youth. In October 1987, during my freshman year, the Dow Jones experienced the largest one-day percentage decline in history, Black Monday. Only through the humanities, the intersection of geopolitical history, economic theory, and political science can one fully understand the international actions that triggered that particular stock market collapse. Such matters addressed in isolation do not lead to any significant understanding. Up and down Curry Hall, some of the wealthiest students were now the ones unsure if their parents could swing the spring tuition. They were worried about the well-being of their parents. Next semester, every single student was back. The university had addressed their situations privately. Again, tradition need not be some rearguard action, but rather can be and should be a positive way of expressing in concrete terms that you are valued, that you are a member of our community, not our club, our community, and we will support you in your noble pursuits. To the undergraduates here today, I understand the pressures you feel from your parents, from your peers, and most greatly from yourselves. Yet I cannot overstate the gift that awaits in the art gallery, in the music hall, on the stage, if you will only unplug and allow yourself an evening of well-earned delight. Today we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Warren Center, and I admire the center staff, the center itself, and certainly its mission. By the time I was in my first literature class, the English department had taken down the fugitive agrarian photographs, actually. But now I believe there's a more nuanced approach here and on other campuses, especially around the contributions of Warren himself, John Crowe Ransom, Alan Tate, and their students, Clinton Brooks, Peter Taylor, Robert Lowell, and others. But if we are to speak of it as a tradition, let it be for Warren's achievement in segregation and Who Speaks for the Negro, as much as for his Pulitzer Prize-winning poetry or for his novel, All the King's Men. Let us acknowledge how male this chain is, even as we note the emerging literary careers of female writers they supported as editors and reviewers, such as Vanderbilt students Elizabeth Spencer and Ellen Gilchrist, as well as Eudora Welty, Catherine M. Porter, Flannery O'Connor, and others unaffiliated with the university but who often came here. And on the issue of the Southern literary tradition, I'm reminded of something that happened at the Fellowship of Southern Writers gathering some years ago. I wasn't there, and I'm going to fact check some of this with Natasha Trethewey. But on a panel, various writers were discussing how the region's literature was profoundly shaped by the losing of the Civil War. And as I understand it, that's when Natasha Trethewey spoke up and said, "My South didn't lose that war." Do you see the essentialness of that? We must always ask, who is the we? I learned to ask this question from two mentors, classical studies professor Susan Ford Wiltshire and English professor Michael Kraling. Whose South? Must the straight, white, male Southerner with Confederates in the attic always be the official voice? Can, for example, Trethewey, born in Mississippi to an African-American mother and a white Canadian father, be the voice? Can this former U.S. poet laureate and winner of the Pulitzer Prize be the voice? Of course, the answer is yes. And who does she hold up as a literary model? Robert Penn Warren, among others. And she is no casual reader of his work. She knows it inside and out, and she holds him accountable, and in doing so, holds us as readers and citizens accountable. In her final laureate lecture, titled The Quarrel with Ourselves, Robert Penn Warren's World of Action and Liability, Trethewey wrote, quote, "What I want to point out is that we miss something of the transformative power of language across time and space when we consider only certain works in isolation, and not a writer's body of work across a lifetime with its revisions and repudiations, as well as its holding fast to some earlier iterations." Warren's permutations throughout his work are particularly relevant to our historical moment in which the pursuit of justice is frequently undermined by a lack of accountability, both personal and societal, unquote. About her own awakening as a poet in our native Mississippi, Trethewey wrote, "My Mississippi, my native land, with its brutal history of oppression and its terrible beauty, hurt me into poetry, rooting me at the crossroads of the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, staking my claim there," unquote. Again, we return to the words claim and rooting and the concept of tradition. But tradition refined, clarified, rebuilt, expanded, but not destroyed. There is, after all, enough destruction in the world without our added efforts. Here, Trethewey is echoing one of the central arguments that Eliot makes about the literary tradition, namely that what is new reorders the past, even as it falls short of remaking it. If literature is not your field, then substitute a scientist for a poet. Think of the before-after impact of Newton or Einstein, or if it fits better, U.S. presidents or corporate executives or university chancellors or federal agency heads, or any notable group that has a clear and long lineage. And there's a rather long quote from Eliot, and I am definitely going to have some water before I start that. I'll tell you when it's over. It's long, but it's worth quoting at length. So Eliot wrote in the context about how the present interacts with the past. No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation is the appreciation of his relationship to dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must set him for contrast and comparison among the dead. I mean this as a principle of aesthetic, not merely historical criticism. The necessity that he shall conform, that he shall conhere, is not one-sided. What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art which preceded it. The existing monuments form an ideal order among themselves, which is modified by the introduction of the really new work of art among them. The existing order is complete before the new work arrives. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered, so the relations, proportions, values of each work of art toward the whole are readjusted. And this conformity between the old and the new. Whoever has approved the idea of order, this idea of order, of the form of European, of English literature, will not find it preposterous that the past shall be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And the poet who is aware of this shall be aware of great difficulties and responsibilities, unquote. As a federal grant maker in the humanities, I find Eliot's perspective illuminating. For example, Annette Gordon-Reed's definitive research on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings changed what came before in terms of the existing scholarship. Her book did not alter colonial history itself, but it did result in a reordering of what is highlighted and why, or why not. The NEH-funded Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War not only made Shelby Foote famous and sent tourists to National Park's battlefields by the busload, it also greatly altered visual narrative storytelling. Likewise, NEH multi-year funding in the digital humanities for the transatlantic slave trade database has transformed our understanding of the magnitude of this global horror and has changed the fields of history, economics, political science, and jurisprudence on 4 continents. On a more local scale, our agency's annual funding for Humanities Tennessee leads to fresh ways of communicating state history to new generations. And they are joined in this effort by the remarkable new Tennessee State Museum, which I toured yesterday. I cannot overstate how impressed I was with the facility itself, with the staff, with their curation. If I were a dean trying to address the decline of English and history and secondary education majors, I would be in close contact with such a museum about internships, even possibly 1-hour credit courses that partner museum professionals to develop practical skills in these fields. Time after time, when I meet an undergraduate engaged in the public humanities, I know that she is going to be a better doctor or lawyer or engineer, a better citizen in the world, regardless of her chosen profession, because of this immersive experience. The cultural argument that I want to make is that the humanities are more relevant when they are in the public realm. If the humanities are only to live on within the campus walls, even such a wonderful campus as this, then it's still an impoverished vision of the humanities, and it's also not fully democratic. Access is important to me. Coming from a rural state, graduating in a class of 29 people in my high school, I cannot overemphasize how important it is to allow people, especially students, to have the arts and the humanities in their daily lives. And there should be no economic barriers to this. I have committed to civic engagement as an anchor of my chairmanship, which is to say I've committed to access to knowledge across our 7 grant divisions. As I move toward a summing up, I hesitate to launch even briefly into such a complex topic as the decline of liberal arts enrollment across the nation, even our most distinguished universities. And I don't believe this trend line is going to change in the near future, but we can take concrete steps to arrest its fall. And in doing so, we can separate our institutions from its competitors. Take the field of philosophy, for example. It was already in enrollment decline when I was a student here. But now, with the rise of artificial intelligence and self-driving cars and medical advances linked to gene mapping, and now the birth of gene-edited infants, the need for courses in ethics and bioethics has never been higher in our lifetimes. In the past month, I spoke at a university that had created a new class on ethics and technology. They had to open 4 sections to meet the demand. I can see a business school, a law school, a divinity school, medical school, engineering department coming together with philosophers at a humanities center, such as the Warren Center, to discuss how they might team teach such a liberal arts class. Every year, NEH awards planning and implementation grants to support curriculum changes to help departments and entire divisions rethink their course offerings in a manner that stays true to their core educational objectives, but recognizes where we are in the 21st century. Another issue in my own field of literature is the need to focus more on drawing students into a deeper relationship with the written word and oral culture, rather than overwhelming them with jargon-laden literary theory as a recruitment tool. To be in front of a classroom at a university level, you need to be an expert in a topic, absolutely. But we should not get so narrow in our interest that we are no longer focused on conveying knowledge in a general sense to undergraduates. In my own field of literary criticism, I worry that we have spent so much energy dissecting the body, we have failed to tell people why we loved it. As everyday people, we do not read to unpack metaphors, but because we love to read, because it deepens our understanding of the world. It creates empathy in us, enables us to go about our lives as more informed citizens. I wish that we would take more of our finest professors and have them in our introductory classes. I wish that we would spend more time talking about how we came to love these works, as opposed to chasing buried messages between sentences. Consistent with his own reserved personality, T.S. Eliot stated in his essay that, quote, "Poetry is not a turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality, but an escape from personality," unquote. I must differ with him. I can name great poem after great poem rooted in emotion and personality and created in our age, from Alden to the Beats to the New Formless. The same could be said of Yo-Yo Ma with his cello, of the outsider artist Billy Traylor. Once, and I don't have this on the page, but when I was at the Arts Endowment, for about 8 years of my life, I was working with troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, helping process what they were going through. My daughter was 4 or 5. We didn't always tell if I was in Afghanistan or Bahrain or the Persian Gulf. And we had about 10,000 pages submitted to us. And Random House was bringing out the book, and we couldn't put everything in the anthology, Operation Homecoming. And a mother called me at the office as the book came out. Our son had died, and I think it was in a SARS accident. He died before he got in the war. And she said, you know, you didn't put it, I sent you his work, and you didn't put it in this book. And it's like his life didn't matter. And I thought, no, ma'am. And I was in the old corner of the old post office, and I'd look out at Washington Monument. I could see Marine One going by. The sun was going down, and I'd missed supper again. My daughter would be asleep by the time I got home. And I went all the way back to my undergraduate years, and I didn't have the whole poem in my mind. And you know not to begin a sentence with a conjunction, and you know not to be repetitive. But this poem begins with a conjunction, and every stanza begins and ends with the same line. And his death shall have no dominion. And I said it to myself at the Metro over and over, more or less weeping, and death shall have no dominion. So I'm a big believer in what emotion can do in the right moment. And so I reject the coldness of Eliot's admonition, even as I understand his call to artistic self-control. Indeed, having served as a federal director or chairman for more than 10 years for 3 very different presidents. I am well acquainted with the idea of self-control. But ultimately, I believe that we must risk being vulnerable, and I learned that here. I learned that the culture of the humanities is the culture of resilience. It is the culture of knowledge, of tolerance, of inclusion and diversity. Your presence here means that you understand the humanities' value and its fragility, and you are committed to shoring it up. We as a nation need to attend to our cultural resources, because if we do not, slowly but surely, we will lose our way. We will lose any deep and abiding understanding of our nation's ideals. I was reminded of this fact in the rain and the night fog as my colleague Carmen and I walked the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum and paused before the rows of empty lit chairs and took in the sight of the smaller chairs, the ones which represented the children in daycare that were killed in that act of domestic terrorism. Our guide pointed across the darkened stone outline of the building towards Survivor Tree, the American elm that came through the destruction and around which survivors and visitors gather to find solace and comfort. So no, the humanities are not a luxury, are not frivolous, are not divisive. Rather, the humanities are what bind us together in our common journey, especially in times when the better angels that Lincoln spoke of seem so far away. Your humanities centers and museums and libraries, your talent-filled classrooms, these wondrous spaces are not citadels, they're sanctuaries. So I reject Eliot on the topic of emotion and the vulnerability implied in revealing one's emotion. There are times in life when we are meant to be vulnerable, when we cannot help but give ourselves over to unchecked emotions, to great loves and sorrows, to unwinnable causes, to righteous hungers, to the fullness of our humanity. Here, behind the magnolia curtain, I came to first and fully understand myself as a creature in time and space separate from all others. It was a blessed awakening. It was startling and unsettling and ultimately liberating. And to my great surprise, it continues to this day and this moment. There are so many Vanderbilt traditions. This was in part mine. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
A+, really moving.
How about this guy? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Young Dad. We do have time for some questions, and I suggest that those who have questions approach the microphone.
Please.
Since I'm close by, what would you consider the hardest part of your chairship? Oh, I'm sorry. I just was wondering what the hardest task for being chair of the National Endowment for the Humanities might be.
I know I'm supposed to say something thoughtful, but it seems to be laundry. I think you do need to find a through line. I said in an earlier group, the fortunate part is I served, there's been a lot of remarkable leaders of the two endowments, but it's hard to equal in some ways what Dana Gioia did, and he's very compelling. And so I had the opportunity to see a great chairman, and that was very helpful to me. I do know now there's a certain advantage of these appointments that only last 4 years, and the Senate confirmations take so long that I think we're going to see shorter and shorter chairmanships. And I led the agency for an entire year before my confirmation, for example. in your mind, you need to have the long-range planning of a marathoner. You need to have all, it's not unlike leading a university. At the same time, with your body, you need to be a sprinter. And so if we looked at today, if meeting with faculty, giving a speech, maybe being in a museum yesterday, if we look at each one of those as an activity, my staff said that I think we're at 260 in the last 18 months. So about every 12 hours, I've given a speech or something, about 32 states so far in the last 18 months. So, it's a lot about pacing, and what you have to worry about is you can make this whole chairmanship, black ties, shake hands, and you have to know you can't do everything. And so I spend a lot of time going to places that have never seen a chairman. It's an honor and means so much to me to be here. But I spent a week in the Badlands of South Dakota for a reason. At Crow Agency, Montana, at a school that has 400 students enrolled at its high year, we were the agency, the only federal agency that came for the commemoration of the 1868 treaty. That treaty was breached, Custer was sent in, and I felt honored. They asked me to speak, and they said, no, would you enter in the tribal ceremony? That's the standing of the humanities out in the world. And so I spend a lot of time making sure I get to places that I haven't seen a chairman before. And so it is, this has been a complex time. There are two narratives, and they're both true, and I spend a lot of time making sure that people know we're open for business. So it's true that we have the largest budget since 2010. We've had 3 straight budget increases under this presidency. The largest budget since the second year of the Obama administration. The White House, the Trump White House, has also recommended closure each of those years, and Congress has come back. The House under Paul Ryan twice, and the House under Pelosi, and the Senate each time, and recommended a budget increase. And I think that's because the value of the agency is understood by the states in a particular way. So my job is to be a good steward of the tax dollars that we're always expressing that. And my colleague Carmen's here. When we have great coverage of the important work we're doing, we send that to the White House, and they're glad to see it. No one wants to see an agency fail in the awarding of tax dollars. So I say to people, I'm a middle child. I find that there's a path with each person, and it's my responsibility to find that path with them. But you have to sum up probably in your first year, maybe first 6 months, what you want to do. You implement it for 2 years, and then you try to embed it. So I'm spending a great deal of time looking at the year 2026 and the 250th anniversary of nationhood. And that's not an exclusionary conversation. That means that we will, by definition, talk about Native American indigenous culture more completely as for continuity. And so it's again back to both and, but a lot of it is saying that at a certain point you've got to move beyond process. I think what's the hard part of your jobs is about there's so much as process and meeting, and at a certain point I'm a big believer in let's just get on with it, and we have a great team. I cannot overstate the quality of the endowment staff. Yeah, thank you.
I think I've got the mic.
Yes.
Thank you for the talk and for, I think, giving us some words, which are often hard to come by, to just articulate what we love about what we do, but that sometimes I think you're right, are missing in our kind of day-to-day business, and even sometimes terribly in the business of teaching maybe. And one of the things that you said that I found so striking was that you worry about students not just picking up a book and reading, right? And this worries me too. I think it worries a lot of us. And I wonder if you have any thoughts, not a program, but any thoughts about how we encourage that, how we maybe undo some of the traditions of the undergraduate curriculum or of the way, the pace of student life to enable that curiosity to really be unleashed. I was struck, just a quick story, as head of the new E. Bronson Ingram College, that I asked the seniors in the college to submit the name of a book that they'd like us to purchase for the college library as they go out to kind of as their mark on the college. And the seriousness with which they took that task, you know, to come up with a book and explain what they loved about it. And, you know, to me that was such a hopeful sign that they have not lost their curiosity. But I think sometimes we are doing a lot to squelch their kind of free imaginations in these very structured environments.
Yeah. Believe me, I so wish I had the answer, and a lot of wise people before me have tried to tackle this. I do think it's incremental, but when I talk about let's get on with it, I think, you know, we can look at best practices. When I went here, you know, I alluded to, you know, kind of, you know, you can see that I liked working in medical environments, right? Labs, hospitals. I'd be happy to end my career in a hospital. You know, love medical, narrative medicine, for example. But I wasn't academically built for it. I had no gift for it. And so how I figured that out, it was an interesting class that it might have taken me 2 more years to act on it, you know, to get up the gumption to talk to my parents about it. But there was a class, I think it was called Chemical Writing, and I could tell the science people wrote it because that wasn't at all what we did. But what they would do is a 1-hour credit, and you know, all these big 4-hour classes, and I could get a 1-hour credit in chemistry here. So I think probably my sophomore year. And they'd bring in a speaker, and they would speak for the first 30 minutes. And this class only 1 hour credit, so probably like an hour and 15-minute class or something. And then you had the next 30 or 40 minutes to write longhand. This is back when we had penmanship skills that I think, yeah, so good luck to the TA that has to deal with that idea. You know, I can't fix everything. But, and so there were students in the class who got all the chemical discussions, right? They understood it. They simply could not get it on the page. I wrote this quickly. I mean, I thought, why are you giving me 30 minutes? I only need 5. You know, I could synthesize what I'd heard, put it down. You know, I'd drop in. I would drop in Socrates. You know, I mean, it was a bit much, right? I was insufferable in some ways. And I got an A. It was an easy A. And unfortunately, my parents and I both received it as I can get an A in the sciences. This is, you know, this is absolutely the wrong data to extract from that experiment. It was that I was meant to be an English major. And later, you know, I think a geologist was my advisor. And he thought to me, he said, but you don't really necessarily understand the concepts. I'm like, no, it's all over my head, but I can certainly summarize it, you know. And I think as we start thinking about the public humanities, I think particularly institutions that are well-cited, we're going to have to talk about partnerships in the classroom, out of the classroom. I think it's moving a big ship to create 3-hour classes. Since my daughter's at Blair, I know a lot about how hard it is to have electives for some students, engineering, the musicians, for example. But a 1-hour class that gives them particular skills. My same resume that I hear spoken of nicely, you know, there was a time that was a dilettante's resume. And then it became a generalist, you know, and then, you know, after you do one of these jobs that, you know, they tell you are personal letters, whatever. It's the same resume, you know. And I was fortunate in this. I'm out of grad school by 23. I'm married, I'm a book editor, married at 25. You know, everything kind of hit, you know, like this. And Ferris recommended me to that book editing job where I met my wife on the first day of work. And they wanted the lowest person in the English department to go get the visiting writer. Well, that happened to be Dana Gioia, which was a good decision. And you know, in a decade, we correspond some poems. You know, my poems are unpublished. His are in the New Yorker. But a decade later, he says, can you leave Millsaps College where I was, and can you move to Washington and be my speechwriter? And so I did. But what happened in the middle is I went to an interdisciplinary master's program under a folklorist, Bill Ferris. So if you stop in the humanities at the master's level and you're meant to terminate at the master's level, or less so the MFA in creative writing, but maybe it's parallel, you know on the back end you're going to be work for a TV station, a radio station, National Park Service, become a curator, a book editor, whatever. You knew that you were going to have some other applied humanities. And then job led to job, so I just never went back, from a degree, and somewhat always, regretted that. Because Ole Miss wanted to offer me a law degree or, doctorate back in English, and I took a job, and I thought I would, I never knew that would be the end of the formal part of my education. But we don't have, as we go higher and higher in doctoral education, I get it, we start closing doors to our candidates, and I understand that. And what can we do? Well, first, we can stop talking about these as alternative careers. I am not, in some pejorative way, having an alternative academic career. I am having what I was meant to have, what you trained me to have, and I'm a humanist. And this is an okay outcome. And to say that this means for others, for musicologists, ethnomusicologists, why can't that dissertation be a podcast or a website? Why can't we have some kind of applied humanities in anthropology, for example, working to develop an incredible museum exhibition? Can that not count toward tenure? Because if you're talking about transforming lives, if you're talking about fulfilling the mission of education, believe me, that impacts there. And so sometimes, I hesitate to say it's generational because some of the most forward-thinking people I know, are at the end of their careers or have been retired. But it takes somebody, not just an administration, but department chairs to say, we're going to be open-minded about this, that our way isn't the only way. And then, and here and there, universities are starting to have conversations about if we had enough money for 20 PhDs, but we don't believe that field can absorb 20, and we're starting to narrow them down to 14, but maybe we can financially support them more or differently. And so I feel more at ease when I'm on this campus. I talk to massive state universities, and they need so many TAs to teach remedial English that they can't turn off the spigot of PhD, and that's the deep anxiety. On the other side, and Chancellor and I were talking about this briefly, is those great R1 notable top 15 universities such as where we are, they can't abandon the humanities, and it's so easy to do if they don't watch it. And so the alumni get this, I think, in particular ways. Sometimes, I said if I had an extra, and I can't quite see, but I know that I knew I worked with the admissions director here, John Gaines, when I was at Millsaps. John's a great person, and he went to Liberal Arts College, Transylvania, so I know he gets it. But on most campuses, if I had an extra half day, I would go and talk to admissions counselors. They're 22, 23. They've had some grief. They've seen the stress of college and whatever happened in their parents' life, but they haven't lived 30, 40 years and seen how much you need the humanities just to get you through the world. And I would say to them, I love the idea of faculty leaders going to them. I said at lunch, or, all the Phi Beta Kappa, if 20 Phi Beta Kappa faculty said they're going to go talk to admissions officers, no admissions director is going to say that's not going to happen. And to kind of use evidence-based, talking, not feel good, but saying, we know year in, year out, if you want to go to med school, of the large majors, English has the highest acceptance rates. Music has the highest percentage, but it's a smaller field. And these vary here and there, but that's been pretty much a through line. I don't think it's a small thing that Kaplan asked me to teach the LSAT, on the side as an undergrad because I was an English major here, But anyway, it's little things. Instead of this kind of mass gesture, we get so many transitions in boards, and other people. I don't think you can go for the whole grand slam, but field by field, and make it doable. And not everything costs a good bit of money. And our $100,000 curriculum change grants, we'll give tens of thousands of dollars to let you convene in $100,000 for changes, and that adds up. But we're giving out $155 million a year exactly to help incentivize this. Yeah.
Chairman Peedy, thank you so much for that wonderful talk, and I am going to tell all of my students to go get some unearned delight, especially right now in this season. I'm really curious, as you ended talking about the humanities are better when they are done in public, and you mentioned that the importance of civic engagement and access to knowledge. I'm actually curious about what goes beyond just access to knowledge in institutions like museums and libraries, and thinking about actual public engagement within communities with the work of the humanities. And you began talking about, humanities is something we do. How do we get more doing of the humanities in local communities?
That's an excellent question. And part of I understand academically why we have to have the arts and humanities separate. But when we take our kids to something and go, and now we'll have the arts day, and now we'll have the humanities day. So I think so many times the humanities, when they're being expressed in public, are going to be closer to the arts and married with the arts. And I may ask you to reframe some of this so I don't lose too much of the thread there. But part of it is find concrete partners that are there year after year. So if you have something you feel like you're not getting the community to come to your lectures, well, the Humanities Tennessee is planning the Southern Book Festival every single fall, and to talk to them that we believe this is a good idea. We'll kind of push it with our students or what have you. I believe part of it is, even in our own endowment, with the National Science Foundation for decades, we've been documenting endangered languages. But what we do now simultaneously is language revitalization. And I think that's the metaphor here, is that the humanities for a long time were about preserving culture. And we still do it, and I believe in it. But now it's about turning it outward. It's about having things online and meta tagging and communicating in some ways that if you want to erase some of those barriers, I can talk about being online, I can talk about being free, but I can tell you when I was at Crow Agency Reservation and I drove for 6 hours without a cell signal, no matter how much I'm putting up online at the endowment, I'm not changing, everything. So some of it is really going to be analog in a lot of communities. But I also think meeting people in the space they're in is important. I probably have never seen a more effective civics cultural project than the Big Read in a very different way, Poetry Out Loud, because they were at libraries, because we asked the grantee to express the idea. Some faculty members heard me say this at lunch, but when we piloted this Big Read, when I was a Big Read director, and it was in statewide in Arkansas, even though it's supposed to be in each city. And they called us and they said, we got in the newspapers. And I thought they meant our educational guide that we'd written. I thought, 3,000, 4,000 words in newspaper, that's so great. And they said, no. Scribners, we worked with them. We serialized The Great Gatsby. The Little Rock, I don't know if Fayetteville and West Helena also ran it. They went to Scribners, they serialized 40-something thousand words. Because no one told them they couldn't do that, right? I think we'd be embarrassed. I'm not chairman of the English department. I'm not going to call Scribners and ask them to say, But if you're a local leader, a civic leader, a community leader, you don't know what you can do. And I love that, absolutely love that. And they took existing ideas they had and partnered so many ways on and off campus. And I see that in important ways. I've been here when we want to have talk about the Holocaust and the way we bring in different groups. There's synagogues have brought in. We have the educational materials. And that's the important part, I'd say, why the university is so important is you have the content experts. And most often you have the content. And so, I do mean that I lived in these stacks, Mark Jarman, professor here. Mark was on leave. I didn't study on poetry of Mark, but I found Black Riviera, his book, and I read it here. But I studied with Ruth Fainlight, the British poet, here instead. And but it was going down, and forgive me, librarians had to reshelf 50 books, but I couldn't keep the order straight, And but it is about having the resources. It's about having the talent, and then it's about unlocking the talent for the people who don't have the means or not enrolled here. And it has the advantage of addressing town gown issues. I think we're way past time. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you.